Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders. Today we'll be diving into the second video in my Pearl Theory series, this time taking the abstractions that we made in the first video and bringing them to a point where they can more so be used to sort of define macro strategy as opposed to just being what they are, abstract comparisons. If you haven't watched that first video, I'll drop it both in the description and in the corner. It will be massively impactful in terms of your ability to understand what we're going to go through in this video, so I highly recommend taking the 10 minutes to go check it out. But assuming you already have, let's dive right into this. To start out, of course, we need our abstractions. To then take those and shift them into something a little bit more actionable, we're going to use them to tackle a couple of macro strategic contributors. We'll try to take them on in order, but in all reality, once you start one, everything becomes an intermingled mess and reliant on each other, so we'll take it one step at a time. The first of these contributors is going to be Orb Bias, which is quite simply whether or not there's a clear-sightedness to orbs and, by extension, alt economy in the map's steady state. Next we have Transitional Space Bias, which, like I said, if you haven't watched the first video, this is where you're going to start getting a little bit lost. This is just going to be whether or not transitional space favors one side or the other. After that, we have Inherent Map Bias on default. Phrased differently, this is going to be us looking at whether or not the map creates situations where one team can demand disproportionate amounts of util or headcount allocation from the other side. A great example of this in practice is going to be something like a bottlenecked corridor where an opera with no other support can still demand util from their opponents. Think Fracture B main, Haven C long, Breeze's Cave, there are a ton of them. Moving on, we have the two big ones, starting with attacker site preference. This is, with all else being equal, just which sites and site hit styles the map wants the attackers to use, ranked in a hierarchy. And I'll be using that sort of map personifying language a lot from this point onward. Things like, what does the map want us to do, what is the map encouraging, and what's being incentivized. But there are going to be a lot of factors that go into this. How hard is it to take the site's intermediate space? How difficult and util intensive is the exec? How favorable or unfavorable are the cancel options and rotations? And how strong or weak is the post plan? You can start diving even into the dozen or so bullets that drives each of those individually, but that's why we went through the process of the first video. By creating abstractions, we have tangible proofs of concepts of each of these, and that'll sort of keep us from getting mired in the details. The last thing we're going to touch on here is more or less the inverse, the defender site preference, and that's going to be driven by just the opposite of a lot of the same things. The defensibility of intermediate space, the strength of your anchoring options, the speed and strength of your flood rotation options, the same but with your flank options, and how easy a site is to retake. With that lay of the land done, let's start actually applying this to Pearl and kicking it off with Orb Bias. The easiest factor to look into here initially is quite simply who can be gun on the orb first. From barriers or even pre-barriers, defenders have lines of sight on both available orbs. Attackers, however, have a fairly similar situation, so we're forced to get more granular. In the case of the B orb, the natural scaling patterns that attackers want to use go past this orb. Also, the expected defending positions that would otherwise be contesting this orbs are ones that the attackers have to deal with during their normal play pattern anyway for this space. Of course, you're going to end up with earlier info for this B half of the map, which is great and all, but if you start looking at the geometry of the map itself, these forward positions give you horrible fallback options. The gaps in coverage mean that you're not going to have any opportunity to play an elastic defense or a rolling retreat, so we have to look at these positions as sunk cost hard holds, and that decreases their overall value immensely. It's for that reason that we really have to find their value elsewhere, and that elsewhere is in a pre-flank. The questions we need to be asking ourselves when talking about this pre-flank quite quickly just distill down to, why are we flanking in the first place? The obvious one being to try to catch timings, but on a map of Pearl's size where that rotation is going to be anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds, timings aren't going to be consistent. So instead we start looking to the other value of a flank, which is going to be disrupting an offsite post. That's a lot easier to break down into layman's terms and look at with Pearl's A. Going back to our abstractions, both Haven A long and Bind Showers highly encourage flanks, so there's no reason to expect that there would be a different case with Pearl's A. But even if the flanks are good, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to do them? On Bind, you will regularly see deep flanks like this, but there is no mid to accelerate flanks, and what acceleration is available in the teleporters is used as often as is reasonably possible. And Haven A long is a similar but different situations where you'll rarely see deep flanks down Haven C long, and instead, teams will very regularly prefer to accelerate their flanks by transitioning through middle. We're given no real reason to expect that Pearl would be any different, and in fact, the extended length of the map makes it even more likely that we should heavily prefer mid-transitioned flanks over deep flanks. So that makes this push down B long really unappealing, because we'd rather just transition through mid anyway if we were planning to flank, and as we already established, these forward positions don't do all that much for us. You can even look at our mid abstraction of split, and the same thing will still apply. Despite the fact that teams have available, deep extremity flanks that allow them to wrap the entire map, they're still going to opt into a mid-transitional flank whenever possible. So to quickly summarize, attackers naturally scale past this B long orb. Defenders will have to opt into really poor risk-reward propositions if they want to scale up for it, and the preferred defensive flanks mean that those positions don't have much tangential value. Obviously, we went into a lot more broad macro to come to conclusions about a single orb there than you might expect, so for the sake of everyone else's sanity, we're going to sort of speedrun the other orb, because it follows many of the same concepts. Essentially everything we said about the B orb is true of the A orb. It's part of normal attacker scaling. For the defenders, the main value add is going to be a pre-flank, but even then, you'd likely pursue it through mid instead of pre-flanking down long. The key differentiator here is going to be that cover. When we looked at B long, it's a single corridor with huge gaps between obstructions, so you end up with these sunk cost defender positions that are almost untenable. You compare that to the U shape of Pearl's A long, and even the attacker's corridor towards their spawn, and it's vastly more favorable, offering almost a perfect landscape for a defensive rolling retreat. A long story short, if we look at the map's baseline, what it is trying to get us to do, the attackers should want to pursue the B orb, and the defenders should want to pursue the A orb. Fortunately, we can springboard and rely on a lot of what we just talked about for the upcoming topics, so now the real theory speedrun begins. For transitional space bias, Pearl makes our lives super easy. There's only 4 areas to cover. You have the front half of A long, which, if you remember our abstraction and how we sort of took the second half to be an A long, it's mildly attacker biased, but there's that massive caveat that if defenders get enough forward positioning, it goes harshly the other direction. Then we have mid, which we know is super attacker biased because of how harsh the bottlenecks are. Club, which is super attacker biased, it's basically part of their spawn as far as I'm concerned. And the defender connectors, which are the inverse of club, it's just a rotational corridor that the defenders should have more or less unrestricted control of. Default bias is always going to be one of the more convoluted concepts, so I usually try to distill it down to how efficient are defender positions at demanding util, and what direction does that push the play patterns of both teams. This is again where we want to lean heavily on our abstractions. Starting with A long, it's going to be fairly efficient for defenders. Assuming no read, attackers are generally going to be forced to use at least 2 pieces of util to take this space. For example, a site-side smoke and flash akin to Haven, with the added consideration that because of the U-shape of long, if the defenders have shown any inclination to push for that orb like we just discussed, you're probably going to have to burn a piece of info util as well just to insulate against that aggression. In terms of how that biases the default, it's a tricky one because we're saying that this is going to be fairly inefficient for the attackers to take, but at the same time, there's still that lingering caveat of, if we don't take this early and the defenders get to the apex of that corner, we've doubled our work and this side of the map becomes almost closed due to how prohibitive the amount of util to take it will become. Art by comparison will be a little bit less favorable for defenders, but it's almost best looked at split into 2 separate sections, the front half requiring a lot more util trading and facing, and the second being a lot more of an entrenched position for defenders. Leaning on our abstraction again, I like to compare this to how North America was defaulting bind for the majority of the last year. Very heavy focus on showers in the early round to deprive it from defenders, and use that to force a rotation from B early. And using that as our model, you can start hashing out what it may look like in your mind. Generally, attackers are going to be able to take that space with a single piece of EBP, a breach stun with follow-up, or a 2-piece util combo that just abuses the tight space. For the same reasons, defenders will usually play around it with a lot less committal setups like Sage solo stall, Viper solo stall, or Chamber Op solo holds. And with all of those, a common thread will be that defenders put themselves in a position where they assume they are going to have to EBP or use an info tool in the late round if they want to retake that space. Quick side note for those who don't know what the hell I'm talking about, EBP is the term I use for entry by proxy utility, more or less drones, the things that will face for you. The second longer corridor of art is going to be pretty strongly defender-sided, but in a way that's very subject to disruption with just a single smoke from the attackers. This weird dynamic of easy to take space then hard to take space for the attackers is going to show us one of the other behaviors that I think really sells the mid-split abstraction that I know a lot of people had a bit of doubt in, where you're left in this situation where you can take the front half of art super easily, but then you're going to get stonewalled. You want to teeter-totter. When you look at Haven, you're not teeter-tottering generally. If you heavy lean into garage control and then you cancel back towards B, odds are you're just gonna plant B. Likewise, if you clear the B utility and then you go back towards garage, you're probably just hard committing to a C hit. The fact that one of your teeter-totter locations is a literal site makes it very hard to sell fakes. In this situation, it's much more comparable to split, where if I clear utility, invents on split, and then I teeter-totter back towards B heaven, you are in much more of a scenario of doubt as to what I'm going to do to you. My relative proximity to sites introduces more doubt. It's for this reason that mid is going to become one of the more critical areas of the map, and one that requires a lot of min-maxing from defenders to try and disincentivize that teeter-totter behavior. Not only that, but per our abstractions and what we've talked about thus far, almost all defensive flanks really want to be done through a mid transition, so if you lose link control, your ability to do those flanks is compromised. Given that, it shouldn't come as any surprise that one of the pieces of utility for the map that I have mauled about the most pertains to this area. In my opinion, and in staying with our bind abstraction, a core part of Pearl A site will be adaptations of Fnatic's meta-defining bind A Viper wall. Characteristically, the util is multi-purposed as a half-site retake wall and as a simultaneous multi-choke denial. Done correctly, the wall makes art incredibly daunting for attackers and actively disincentivizes the teeter-tottering that we just mentioned we should be worried about. It makes the transition for defenders to take the space back far easier than it otherwise would be. It also supplements the level of punishment that can be levied on attackers when they try to take the second corridor of art. Most importantly, though, it does what all good walls should. It exploits the map's geometry as much as possible for both mid-round and after plans. It facilitates an on-site defense, it facilitates intermediate space denial, it facilitates mid to late round rotations by denying lurk LOSs. In certain compositional matchups, you can even modify the wall to retain the A-site crossfire and instead introduce a B-link lurk facilitation to open a B-long wrap. If you know a team is going to be leaning into B-long bind-style afterplants, then throw this wall and make it so that they are forced to either permanently put someone on flank denial or have a flank trip. I'm not going to mince words, I think that this wall, pretty much by itself, hardlocks Viper compositionally for any team trying to significantly convert on the defense half of this map. The wall is genuinely too efficient, and given that Viper will have access to both art and all of A site, you're also looking at a playable space large enough that KOs aren't going to be able to knife her consistently. But I digress, enough ranting about Viper walls. Moving to B-Link, there will be a lot less band-aiding required from defenders. The Savage bottleneck at doors makes this pretty much impossible for attackers to even consider without burning a smoke, and even then, if defenders are using a piece of passive info util, it pars up almost perfectly with our Icebacks analogy and the Kitchen Killjoy turret. In the same breath, that means that there's also going to be really established play patterns on how to beat this, but that doesn't make them efficient. Going over to B long, it's in many ways the attacker's power budget equivalent to A long for the defenders. At baseline, it's slightly attackers favored, but once you shift past the midpoint, it goes a little bit in the favor of defenders and can be tectonically shifted with the right util. That util, again, is going to come from our abstraction, this time Icebox B long, and shocker, it's a Viper wall. This cross-site wall will come with a lot of flavor depending on your comp, your opponent's comp, predicted opponent reactions, and even just plain team preference. It can be adjusted a few different ways to balance plantable space, anchor positions, and post-plant supplement depending on what you want. For instance, B-link disruption in one, or a soft denial of the deep flank in another at the cost of shifting an available anchor position. Regardless of which wall you throw, or even if you have a wall, the intent is likely not going to change, and that's going to be that this site really drives you towards a corner plant and offsite post. And this is where we start getting married back into our intermediate space analysis, looking at B long. Regardless, let's move on and summarize this all. A-Long has a very minor defensive bias on the sight side, but it's one that defenders are encouraged to extend and one that attackers are nearly required to deny if they plan to finish on that half of the map. Art has a weak attacker bias on the front end with a harder defender bias on the back end, and it's one that defenders are encouraged to overwhelm with landscape shifting utility like Viper Walls or static disincentive like Astra Util. B-Link is really defender biased, but it also has well-established counterplay patterns for attackers. And B-Long has a minor attacker biased front end, a minor defensive biased back end, and it's one where the attackers are incentivized to use landscape shifting util to shift that balance in their favor, and simultaneously, defenders are disincentivized from disentrenching from sight and moving too far forward. With that all down, it's crunch time. What should the attacking site preference be? Again, this is just going purely at baseline, ignoring comps. We're looking at what the map wants us to do. B-Link's bias means that B-splits will generally be weaker than full Bs. Where defenders are encouraged to pressure A-Long early, A-splits that offer us encirclements on that pressure will generally be stronger than full As. Along a similar line of reasoning, because the map wants defenders to contest A-Long more than B-Long, we expect less resistance at B and place full Bs over full As and A-splits. Now we just have to determine whether B-splits go above, below, or between A-splits and full As, and in order to do that, we have to keep in mind that our top of the list is full Bs. For us to have that best case option available to us as frequently as possible, we're forced to make our opponents respect the opposite side of the map and deny them the reasonable option of stacking B where we want to go. That pushes A-splits, our better A hit, to the second place and leaves us to decide whether full As or B-splits takes the bottom spot. In both cases, we're expecting to meet resistance, but in one's case, the B-split, we keep better cancel options by holding mid-control. Of course, there are also still full hits from links, but because of how defensively strong Pearl's links are, those are pretty obviously going to land at the bottom of the list and are best left for ulti rounds and default rounds where they're catalyzed by a pick or a hard read. So, attacker preferences, full Bs at the top of the list, then A-splits, then B-splits, then full As. Again, this is a baseline looking in a complete vacuum, ignoring compositions. We're just establishing the baseline of what the map wants us to do before our comps and our assumed enemy comps shift it one way or another. Looking at the defender side of things, we're just going to rapid fire our categories from the beginning of the video to save everyone some time. Starting with A, the intermediate space to the site is about a 50-50, but with that lingering defensive appeal to push down A-Long. The site's central hard wall makes our A-site anchoring options quite strong, similar to Bind B, but without the inside of Tube. Our flood rotations are great, comparing it to Fracture B using our abstraction, but on the longer side when it comes to timings. Our flank option is almost singularly driven by timing, so decent with control of either link, awful without. And our overall ease of retake is fairly high. The site wants us to be able to hold its back half, and if we hold B-Link, there's only one corridor for offsite post-plant, and even that can be obstructed by a single smoke. Comparing that to B, for intermediate space, again without making compositional assumptions like a Viper, it's a 50-50 at long and bias for defenders in link. For the site itself, U-Haul makes for a great single or dual anchor position, but excluding that, the amount of soft walls and the safe assumption of a heaven smoke make it for slim pickings. Our flood rotations are less favorable here than on A unless we retain U-Haul control and dual flood from both link and defender spawn. Our flank option is excellent, albeit super long unless we hold B-Link and make our doors exit less dangerous. And overall, the ease of retake is quite a bit lower than A. The attackers having appealing offsite post and us lacking a reliable flank will never be a great situation. And in the case that we lose B-Link or U-Haul pre-retake, the already uphill battle just gets steeper. So for our consideration and summary, A-site wants us to hold back site and lean on an easy retake, and B-site wants us to hold site, link, and do our best to guarantee flank options. That pushes our strong side to B, and our weak side to A. That finally gets us to the end of the road. We now have every baseline we need to build comps. We know where the map wants us to play on either side, where we have strengths and weaknesses, some of the play patterns we're likely to have to employ, and even some util that stands out above the rest. Now it's just a matter of shifting this baseline up and down for our comps and the expected comps of our opponents. Okay, that was the last of the brickwork that we really had to lay as the foundation for this. Now it's the fun stuff, compositional design, playbook development, but as a reminder, this is our baseline. Something that people ask me all the time when I discuss how heavily I use statistics, they say, how do you distinguish between the signal and the noise? And it's all about baselining correctly. If you have a certain perception about something, I think X agent should be phenomenal on Y map, and then I go to the statistics, and it says that that agent sucks ass, I'm gonna then ask myself, okay, where is my intuition incorrect? Is it possible that these statistics have been polluted? And how do I sort of reconcile my own perception versus the baseline? We now have that baseline, so when we go forward and we go to comps, we say, I expect X agent to be good for reasons X, Y, and Z. Does that work with the baseline that we've created for what our map wants us to do or not? And how can I dive into why that perception is different? Really excited to hear what you guys think of this down in the comments below. Obviously, this is like deep end theory, and this one got a lot into subjectivity. I'm not going to pretend that this is some sort of scientific method. It's as close to one as I've really found during this process. So would love to hear all your agreement, disagreement, hit me with your best shot type of deal. Would love to talk about it at length. Obviously, I can go on for hours about it. Before we go, wanted to give a quick shout out to my 2 YouTube members, Colin Torbis and Hick Messiah, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next